Can staying at home be saving lives and avoiding killing? COVID-19, lockdowns, and the doing-allowing distinction. Hi, I'm Fiona Woollard. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Southampton. Like people all over the world, I'm currently under lockdown in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Lockdown and its goal have been summarised in 4 words that seem to be everywhere at the moment. Stay home, save lives. But some philosophers have argued that staying home is not saving lives. Instead, they say that we stay home to avoid infecting others with the virus, which would be killing people. This matters because killing and letting die have very different moral status. The difference between killing and letting die is an instance of a more general distinction between doing and allowing harm. This distinction matters morally. We are required to bear much stronger costs to avoid doing harm than we are required to bear to save someone from harm. In this video, we're going to explore why the difference between doing and allowing harm matters and how it applies to COVID-19 lockdowns. I've spent a lot of time thinking about doing and allowing harm, but it didn't occur to me to think about how this distinction applies to lockdown until I read an article by Frowe. Frow argues that framing obeying lockdown as saving lives leads us to make mistakes in weighing up the costs and benefits of maintaining lockdown. If we think of lockdown as saving lives, we will try to work out how much cost we should be prepared to bear to prevent the spread of the virus by thinking about how much we're required to bear to save lives in other situations. But Frowe argues that because lockdown is a way of avoiding killing, we can be asked to bear much greater costs in lockdown than we would be required to bear to save lives. Frow uses 2 thought experiments to support this claim. Thought experiments are short stories or examples that philosophers use to help us think through a philosophical issue. Moral philosophers often use thought experiments to help them work out what features of our behaviour matter morally and how. Frow's thought experiments are, first of all, drowning. In drowning, Alice is caught in the sluice gate of a river and will drown unless she is saved. Betty can save Alice, but only by suffering the loss of her own arm in the process. The second case is fleeing. In fleeing, Betty is fleeing an attacker who will cut off her arm if he catches her. The only way she can escape is by lethally trampling over Alice, who's an innocent bystander. As Frow points out, most people would say that Betty is permitted to let Alice drown in the first case, but that it would be wrong for her to trample over Alice in the second case. Why do people react to the 2 cases so differently? It seems to be because letting Alice drown would be merely allowing harm, while trampling over Alice would be killing her, doing harm. Whether Betty would count as doing harm to Alice or merely allowing harm to Alice seems to affect how much cost Betty is required to bear to avoid the harm. She's not required to sacrifice her arm to save Alice from drowning. She is required to sacrifice her arm to avoid killing Alice. So Frow makes 2 claims. First, that lockdown is not a way of saving others, but a way of avoiding doing harm to them. Second, that we are required to bear greater costs to avoid doing harm to others than to save them from harm. If Frow is right, then we cannot work out if the lockdown is justified by thinking about the sacrifices that we would be required to bear to save others. Instead, we must assess lockdowns by thinking about the costs we would be required to bear to avoid harming others. Or more precisely, we must think about the costs that we would be required to bear to avoid imposing significant risks of harm onto others. Now, I think that Frowe is right that we need to think about the difference between doing and allowing harm when assessing lockdowns. She's right that thinking of lockdowns as standard cases of saving lives is inaccurate. She's also right that it will lead us to underestimate the costs that we should bear to prevent the spread of the virus. However, I think that at least for some lockdown measures, it's also a mistake to think of lockdown as a standard case of refraining from doing harm. The slogan, "Stay at home, save lives," is effective because it seems true. We do feel like we are doing something to combat the virus, like we are saving lives. I think that feeling is correct. I think that some lockdown measures are neither standard cases of saving nor standard cases of refraining from doing harm, but belong to a strange type of case which involves both saving and refraining from doing harm. These cases are distinct from both standard cases of refraining from doing harm and standard cases of saving. This means that when working out whether to maintain lockdown, we shouldn't use comparisons with either standard cases of saving others or standard cases of avoiding harming others. So why do I think some lockdown measures count as doing something to save others? The answer is the degree of restriction on my behaviour. Some lockdown measures restrict my behaviour so much that complying with them is making some positive fact about myself hold. For example, consider restrictions on movement. The most extreme of these require me to stay at home. If I live at 221B Baker Street, I'm required to stay at 221B Baker Street. The fact that I'm at 221B Baker Street is a positive fact about my location. It tells you where I am. To understand this, think about the fact that I'm not in Scotland. This is a negative fact about my location. It doesn't tell you where I am. It merely rules out some place as a possible location. So it tells you that I'm not in Scotland, but I could be anywhere else. On my analysis of the doing-allowing distinction, making a positive fact about one's location hold is doing something. So if a lockdown measure is restrictive enough that it requires me to make a positive fact about my location hold, complying with it will be doing something to prevent deaths. If we're doing something to prevent deaths, then I think we can think of ourselves as saving lives. Nonetheless, if I do go out and infect somebody, I'm still doing harm. I sit on a bus. I breathe, propelling particles of the virus into the air. I touch my mouth and transfer virus particles to my hand, then to the back of the seat. Someone else breathes in my virus particles or transfers them to their mouth after touching the seat. The virus multiplies in their bodies. They pass it on to their family, who pass it on and on. The numbers of infections, of severe cases, of hospitalizations, of permanent disabilities, of deaths mount. My action clearly initiates a sequence of positive facts leading to harm to others. There isn't some independent threat which I could prevent but decide not to. Nor is this a case of withdrawing some barrier that could have prevented an independent threat from causing harm. My behaviour is the threat. any account of harm, I should count as doing harm. So, I think the doing allowing distinction does not apply nicely to sufficiently restrictive lockdowns. Instead, such lockdowns are a strange type of case. In cases of this type, for reasons outside the control of either agent or victim, the agent must perform some action to avoid being relevant to some harm. If the agent performs the protective action, then they will count as saving the potential victim. But on the other hand, if they do not perform the protective action, they will count as doing harm to the victim. So the protective action is both saving and avoiding harming. The costs that we're required to bear in these really weird cases are unlikely to be quite the same as in either standard cases of avoiding doing harm or standard cases of saving. There might also be other differences. So governments may be permitted or even required to prevent some citizens from doing serious harm to others. This would justify legally requiring someone to stay home to save lives, when it just wouldn't be permissible for the government to compel individuals to save fellow citizens in standard saving cases. On the other hand, because such requirements do involve requiring the agent to do something to save others, and also because the setup was outside that individual's control, the government might have extra strong duties to protect those who are imposed on in this way from suffering undue costs. For example, governments might have to provide income support. So to sum up, lockdowns are presented as saving lives. Helen Frowe argues that this is misleading. We should not assess lockdowns by thinking about the costs we're required to bear to save others. Instead, Frow says, we should think about the costs we would be required to bear to avoid imposing significant risks of harm onto others. Frow's argument depends on two claims. First, that we're required to bear greater costs to avoid doing harm to others than we would be required to bear to save others. Second, that lockdowns are a way to avoid doing harm to others, not a way to save others. I think that Frowe is partly right. Lockdowns are not standard cases of saving lives. Sufficiently restrictive lockdown measures may involve both saving others and avoiding harming others. When thinking about the ethics of lockdown, we shouldn't use comparisons with either standard cases of saving others or standard cases of avoiding harming others. So, I've told you what Frowe thinks about lockdowns and the doing allowing distinction. I've told you what I think about lockdowns and the doing allowing distinction. Now comes the really important bit. You need to work out what you think. Here are some questions to ask yourself. So I said that most people think that Betty is permitted to let Alice drown rather than lose her arm, but that she's not permitted to trample Alice to death. Not everyone agrees with these intuitions. What do you think? If you do think there's a difference between the two cases, do you think Frowe and I are right that the best way to explain this is that we have to bear greater costs to avoid doing harm to others than we have to bear to save lives, to save others? Do you think that staying at home is saving lives? What types of comparisons do you think are useful to help us think about the ethics of lockdowns? So just before I leave you, I'm going to give you some further reading. I've talked a lot about Frowe's paper, and there's a link to her paper on this slide, and also some other good discussions from philosophers about the doing allowing distinction and lockdowns, and indeed other ethical considerations surrounding lockdowns. If you're really interested in the doing allowing distinction, you can buy my book, Doing and Allowing Harm, or there's a free Stanford Encyclopedia article which you can read all about doing versus allowing harm. Thank you.